Ethan Ward stood in the doorway of his barn as the cold wind rolled across his ranch, stinging his cheeks and pushing snow through every gap. Winter in Wyoming Territory had a way of humbling even the strongest, and this year it felt like the land had turned against every living thing. He had just finished checking the feed for his cattle when he heard footsteps crunching through the frost. Slow, hesitant steps, nothing like the confident stride of a ranch hand. When Ethan turned, the figure he saw looked more ghost than man. Wrapped in tattered furs, trembling, the trapper stopped just outside the barn, lifting his frost-rimmed hat with hands that shook from more than cold. Ethan recognized him, Markham, a solitary woodsman who owed him more money than either wanted to admit. Ethan had loaned him supplies months back, long before winter tightened its grip. Markham looked thinner than he remembered, his eyes sunken from nights spent running from starvation. The debt between them had hung like a shadow for months, but Ethan never expected the man to show up with nothing but desperation clinging to him like ice. "I've got nothing left," Markham rasped, his breath turning to mist in the frigid air. "No pelts, no traps, no food. Winter wiped me out clean." Ethan crossed his arms, expecting an excuse, maybe an apology, but certainly not what came next. "But I can offer you her." Those words sent a shock through the barn doorway. Ethan opened his mouth to shut the idea down immediately until Markham stepped aside. Behind him, half-hidden, stood a young native woman wrapped in a worn shawl that had lost its warmth long ago. She didn't cling to Markham, didn't lower her gaze like someone fearing punishment. She stood with her spine straight, her chin lifted despite the bruises scattered like shadows across her skin. Her eyes, dark, watchful, unreadable, studied Ethan as if weighing her own fate. She was young, maybe 20, though hardship carved its own lines across any face. Ethan felt his anger rising, not at her but at the situation forced upon her. "I don't buy people," Ethan said, the words sharp enough to cut the cold between them. He had seen traders, raiders, and worse try to put prices on human beings, and every encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. Markham raised both hands quickly, shaking his head. "She's not mine to sell. I found her tied to a post near the ridge, the leftovers of a raider band. I freed her. Fed her what little I had, but I can't keep her alive. I ain't got the strength or the supplies." The woman stepped forward then, not waiting for Markham to speak for her. "My name is Tala," she said, her voice steady but carrying an exhaustion that pulled at Ethan's chest. "I will work for my place. I take nothing that I do not earn." Her words held no tremble, no shame. She wasn't begging, she was offering, trying to build a future from whatever pieces life hadn't stolen yet. Ethan looked at her, then at the trapper, wrestling with a storm rising quietly inside him. His first instinct was still to refuse. To send Markham away with his burdens and try to make sense of a world that constantly pushed cruelty toward the vulnerable. But as Ethan looked back into Tala's eyes, something shifted deep within him. There was strength there, raw, unpolished, but undeniable. The kind of strength a person carried only after surviving horrors that would have broken someone else. And beneath that strength, he saw something even more startling, a flicker of hope, faint but alive. Like an ember refusing to die despite the snow, Markham sensed Ethan wavering and spoke again, quieter this time. "If I leave her out there, she dies. If she stays with me, we both die. You might be the only good man left in this part of the territory." Ethan didn't reply. He was still caught in that fragile moment where responsibility, morality, and instinct collided. Tala shifted her weight, pulling her shawl tighter, but her gaze didn't leave him. She looked at Ethan as though she were deciding whether he was the kind of man who would strike her or shelter her. The winter wind blew harder, pressing snow against the folds of her shawl. Ethan noticed how her shoes were thin, barely holding together, her fingers reddened from exposure. She had been fighting the cold far too long. And yet, she wasn't asking for mercy, only for a chance to earn her survival. That alone tightened Ethan's chest more than Markham's desperation. Ethan finally spoke, softer this time. "Tala, you don't owe me anything. No debt, no bargain." She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer until she stood directly in the lantern light spilling from the barn, The firelight revealed the bruises. More clearly now, the edge of one across her jaw, another fading along her collarbone. Scars older than those marked her wrists, faint but unmistakable. Ethan felt a heat rise in him, not desire, not pity, but a fierce, protective anger he hadn't felt in years. The thought of sending her away, of letting her walk back into the cold with a man who couldn't keep her alive, felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. But more than that, Ethan realized he didn't want her walking away from his home, not into danger, not into darkness. He exhaled slowly. The decision settling into him like a stone dropped into water. "You can stay," he said quietly. "Not as payment? Not for a debt? You stay because it's safe here and because no person deserves to face winter alone." Tala didn't smile, but something eased in her shoulders, as if a weight she had been carrying finally loosened its grip. Markham nodded gratefully, relief flooding through him. He turned to leave, but before he did, Tala whispered something under her breath, soft. Almost lost to the wind, it took Ethan a moment to realize it wasn't gratitude she had whispered, but a promise. Ethan watched Tala move around the cabin with a quiet intensity that made the room feel alive with her presence. She carried buckets of water, stacked firewood, and tended the horses with the steady rhythm of someone who had endured far more than she revealed. He tried to imagine the winters she had survived, the loneliness, the cold that seeped through clothes and skin alike. Each evening she sat by the fire, mending leather with hands that were cracked and red from labor, yet nimble and precise. She complained not once, yet Ethan found himself wishing he could ease her burden somehow. The silence between them became familiar, almost comforting as they worked in parallel around the cabin. Ethan chopped wood while Tala gathered it, her movements fluid and purposeful, her eyes occasionally glancing toward him without seeking approval. He noticed the small details, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, how she paused to let the fire's warmth touch her face, how her hands moved deftly when feeding the animals. There was a strength to her that was different from the men he knew, a quiet resilience that demanded respect without demanding attention, and it fascinated him more than he cared to admit. One evening, after a snowstorm that shook the roof and rattled the windows, Ethan found her sitting near the fire, staring into the flames as though searching for answers. He hesitated before speaking, uncertain if his words were wanted. "You work too hard," he said finally, his voice rough with concern. Tala looked at him with calm, unflinching eyes. "Work does not tire me," she replied. "It is idleness that weighs on the soul." "And you," she added, a small smile tugging at her lips, "you carry burdens you refuse to see. Perhaps you need a companion more than I do." The next morning, she joined him in the barn, her hands raw from splitting wood, her face flushed from effort. Ethan watched her with new awareness, noticing the care with which she handled each task, the precision of her movements. She did not act out of obligation, nor did she seek comfort from him. Her presence was deliberate, chosen, and unshakable. Each day, he felt a subtle pull toward her, a recognition that her strength was something he had not known he was missing. He began to realize that what he felt was more than gratitude, it was a growing dependence. Silent but undeniable, that tugged at his chest. When Tala finally spoke of the debt, her voice was steady, unburdened by resentment or shame. "The man who left me here, he owed you a debt. I do not belong to him. But I will honor the promise he made. I will stay until your debt is gone." Ethan studied her scarred hands and felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He had never thought of her as property or payment, never measured her presence against a ledger or a promise. She was not a means to settle a debt. She was a person, separate and strong. And her choice to stay was hers alone. Ethan's response was slow, deliberate, as if speaking too quickly could ruin the truth he wanted to convey. "I didn't take you as payment. You're free." Tala's eyes softened, a light he had never seen there before flickering in the glow of the fire. "Freedom is not a place," she whispered. "It is a person who does no harm." Her words sank into him, heavier than any storm outside, shaping the corners of his thoughts. He realized that freedom was not something granted through money or authority. But something lived, breathed, and chosen, and she had chosen to stay by him. Weeks passed, and spring crept into the valley with cautious warmth. Tala became inseparable from the rhythms of the ranch, her hands skilled, her movements precise, her presence natural. Ethan found himself noticing her in ways he could not name, waiting for her laughter at breakfast, her quiet hum while tending the animals, the way her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't watching. She had become part of the mornings, the evenings, the spaces between chores and conversation. He realized with a mixture of awe and fear that he could not imagine the ranch without her presence. Her quiet strength and deliberate choices drew him in more deeply than any act of heroism or courage he had seen before. Ethan began to understand that the bond between them was not about obligation or debt. It was something far more intricate, grown in shared labor, shared silence, and shared survival. Each day, he found himself relying on her presence not out of need for work or company, but out of an unspoken understanding that life felt more complete with her near. She was no longer a stranger. She was becoming the pulse of his days. One night, the wind howled across the ridge like wild animals, and Ethan found Tala seated on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark horizon. He joined her quietly, standing close but not touching. Time passed without words, yet it felt complete in itself. Finally, she leaned back against him, not out of obligation, not as payment for a debt, but as a deliberate choice to share warmth. In that moment, Ethan realized with clarity that the connection between them had grown beyond the transactional. It was something entirely human, something that could not be legislated, bargained, or measured. By mid-spring, the ranch flourished under their combined effort, yet that was not what mattered most. It was the quiet mornings, the laughter that rose softly with the sunrise, the simple, deliberate touches, the understanding that required no explanation. Ethan understood that he had not accepted a debt. He had accepted someone whose presence had changed the rhythm of his life. He had accepted Tala, with her resilience, her determination, and her quiet insistence on choosing her own path. And in doing so, she had chosen him in ways he hadn't realized he needed. Ethan finally grasped a truth that had grown slowly. Like sunlight creeping over snow, he had come to take in a stranger, to settle an obligation, to fulfill the promise of another man. But in return, he had received someone far more essential, a companion, a presence, a heart that had anchored his own. Tala, in her steadfastness and gentle determination, had changed him, reshaped his understanding of freedom, choice, and connection. And as he watched her move through the barn one morning, sunlight glinting on her hair, he understood fully that she had chosen him long before he ever understood why, and he would never let her choice go unacknowledged.